So today I want to address a topic which I've kind of alluded to, touched upon, on and off, in various videos, but I thought it's time to really address this. I came across a tweet which spurred the topic of today's video, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to start by saying this. If you remember the early 2000s, and the backlash specifically to 1999's The Phantom Menace, 2002's Attack of the Clones, and to a lesser extent 2005's Revenge of the Sith, then you might find some of the modern revisionism insane. If you were there, then you remember how bad the backlash was. A lot of it was from the media, but also the fans. Fans had waited 16 years for the return of Star Wars, and for a lot of them, The Phantom Menace was a big disappointment. We've spoken about Jar Jar Binks, some CGI decisions, the narrative direction that George Lucas went in. Even the likes of Ewan McGregor, Hayden Christensen, Ian McDiarmid and Ahmed Best regularly talk about it, and how they're so glad, returning to Star Wars in 2024, the fans those films were made for are now grown up, and now appreciate their roles, and that's why they enjoy returning to the galaxy far, far away now. But there seems to be this notion that in this new age of newfound appreciation for 1, 2 and 3, that the prequel backlash back then wasn't bad. That's not true. So the reason I bring this up is a take I came across was this. Fully convinced if Attack of the Clones were released today, people would go to ridiculous lengths to nitpick this scene, and they're talking about the droid factory. You'd have thousands of paragraph-long posts complaining about how this ruined the franchise and asking, why didn't R2-D2 use his jets on Dagobah? And my reaction is, would go to ridiculous lengths. They did. I don't blame fans who may not have been there, but online forums were absolutely littered with complaints for Attack of the Clones. The Phantom Menace arguably received the biggest brunt of criticism, but hate towards Episode 2 was certainly a thing. And not just for R2-D2, but also C-3PO. Anthony Daniels himself brought this up in his autobiography. The creative choice to make C-3PO comic relief was a pretty poor one. Anthony expressed mixed feelings about his role in Episode 2 generally, specifying the bizarre decision to make 3PO the center of a comedic sequence during the Battle of Geonosis, where the character's head is accidentally switched with a battle droid's body. This resulted in a few slapstick moments that fans and Daniels himself felt were completely out of character for the beloved protocol droid. But to pretend the prequels were always so loved, and again of course there were fans who did like them at the time, but to pretend they were unanimously loved, and to also imply that there was no outrage, no fan debates, is a real misrepresentation of history. I mean, George Lucas is on record many times across several interviews in the early 2000s, expressing his personal dismay that whenever he puts something out, fans bash and criticize it. He lamented he always feels as though he has to stay within a box which he said Star Wars fans are responsible for putting him in.
There is a group of fans. They get very, very upset and very opinionated about anything that has anything to do with being childlike. And in the first film, they absolutely hated R2 and 3PO. They haven't liked any of them, really. And they especially haven't liked the last two. You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun. And you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way.
And people forget how quickly fan adoration for what George Lucas did in the 70s and 80s turned to absolute revilement in the late 90s and 2000s. And that's not even touching upon the romance between Anakin and Padme, the dialogue, the visual effects, the pacing and structure, the character development, the fights between Yoda and Count Dooku, the humour, Jango Fett, the clone subplot. I could go on and on. Now personally, I'm a massive fan of Attack of the Clones. Like I said, I was the target age and the target audience. I'll never forget going to see it on opening day with my family. Now the reason, or should I say one of the reasons, the perception is that overall fan backlash is heightened in today's day and age, is because back then, it was limited to the media and online forums. There was no YouTube, no Twitter, the widespread social media culture didn't yet exist. And I think we need to put ourselves in the mindsets of what a teenage or adult fan was going through back then. Leading up to The Phantom Menace, there was so much hefty expectation on the kind of movie The Phantom Menace had to be. It's not that fans had specific plot points or a checklist of things they wanted, although of course there were some. It was more the mythos surrounding the movie that this had to be the one to bring Star Wars back to the mainstream after a decade and a half of anticipation and of drought, but also excitement. George Lucas was seen as a Da Vinci type of artist. working away in the shadows for 15, 16 years, perfecting his masterpiece, so the fandom expected to be absolutely blown away. But I don't think they were ready for the world building, for George to use fantastic visual effects, but to use them to change what Star Wars could be. Fans had followed magazine after magazine, interviews with the cast and crew. Fans were dedicated to getting little bits of information of what George was about to give us, and it became this enormous mythologized event. You know, George Lucas spent so long developing the prequels because the technology just wasn't there in the late 80s, and now that it's here, he's going to give us something incredible, something mind-blowing. And fans had it in their minds thanks to the expanded universe, thanks to fan theories, what the prequels were going to be like. And so when the creative direction was, for the most part, not what fans expected, that's when the backlash happened. The fact George wanted to make this for kids, and felt so tonally different to Return of the Jedi. But I think it's important to remember when we talk about fan backlash, it's nothing new. To say it just existed since The Force Awakens is just misremembering how far back this goes. I mean, even back in '83, the backlash to the Ewoks, and the prequel hate lasted well into the 2010s. Even during the Clone Wars series, a lot of adult fans were like, I'm not watching that, it's not the Star Wars I love. And this anti-prequel sentiment gave rise to renewed hope for the sequel trilogy at the time, for those who weren't too big on Menace, Clones, and Sith. I thought maybe abbreviating them would sound cool, but anyway. And even when the Force Awakens teaser trailer came out, some of those comment sections were full of people saying, well, at least this is not the prequel trilogy. At least Disney is going to do something better with Star Wars than what George did with 1, 2, and 3, and they're returning to practical effects, not relying on CGI, and this is going to feel much more like the originals. Ironic looking back, that fans at the time saw hope in Episode 7. And just to give you even more context, in 2006, Patton Oswalt had a stand-up routine that was literally aimed at the subculture of backlash towards what George Lucas did, which appeared on his 2007 comedy album, Werewolves and Lollipops. In 2001, at the start of the second season of the iconic sitcom Spaced, Simon Pegg's character Tim loses his job over his hatred of the Phantom Menace and of Jar Jar Binks. Even shows like The Simpsons have made comedic jabs because this hatred was so widespread. J.J. Abrams joked he considered putting the deceased remains of Jar Jar Binks into the desert of Jakku to send a message to old-school fans that his Star Wars was not going to be anything like the prequel trilogy, which in 2015 was seen as a good thing. He told Vanity Fair, quote, I've thought about putting Jar Jar's bones on the desert. I'm serious. Only 3 people will notice, but fans will love it. So it's pretty crazy. In the 2020s, Hayden being back in the Kenobi show, he's also in Ahsoka, and now the sequel trilogy is hated, as well as some of the more recent shows. So you can see why people like Ewan McGregor, as I say, Hayden Christensen, and other actors who were involved in the 2000s Star Wars are so pleased that they're now being appreciated for their work, and they deserve it. Because say what you will about the prequel trilogy, to my mind, it's still a coherent story by George. Yes, there are retcons, yes, George didn't care about canon as much as fans would like to believe, but his 6 films still work as a coherent, cohesive saga. And now the question that always gets brought up, are the sequels going to be much more liked than they were when they came out in 10, 15, 20 years? They certainly have their fans. Maybe not as much as the prequel trilogy, but the main argument for the no position is that unlike the prequel trilogy, which was one man's vision, the sequel trilogy really goes back on itself, especially between episodes 8 and 9. So there is much less of a consistent narrative between the 3 movies. It was really The Last Jedi that got the most backlash of the 3 sequel movies, and by the time of The Rise of Skywalker it was more apathy. But who's to say kids who grew up watching the sequels won't love them in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Star Wars fans would have laughed at you in the 2000s if you said the prequels are going to be absolutely beloved the fandom over in the 2020s. If you saw what people were saying, you would have thought it was inconceivable back then, and yet here we are. And one of the most exciting things for fans is seeing the return of Hayden Christensen as Anakin, and again, hopefully in Ahsoka Season 2. And I just want to finish by saying this. At Star Wars Celebration last year, when I was mingling amongst fans, getting to know people, socializing, I noticed, although I would say the majority of people I spoke to would cite the original trilogy as their favourite Star Wars, there were more fans than I've seen at any other convention in previous years saying things like The Phantom Menace or Revenge of the Sith. But in there were also families where the kids loved Rey or BB-8, and more people than you'd expect were saying The Last Jedi. Just an anecdote, but what do you guys think? So just a different topic of conversation for today's video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and may the Force be with you, always.